Good evening. I'm Warren Liu. I'm an associate professor in the English department here at Scripps College, and I'm very excited to welcome Monique Truong to Scripps and to Scripps Presents, branding. Um, I have a very easy job. I'm just actually going to be introducing the introducer. I'll be introducing Leila Mansouri, who will come up and talk to us a little bit more about Monique Truong's work. Leila Mansouri is an assistant professor of English at Scripps College, where she teaches fiction writing and early American literature. Her scholarship focuses on the intersections between literary and electoral representation in the early United States, and her creative work on these topics and life in the Iranian diaspora can be found in The Believer, The Offing, Los Angeles Review of Books, and elsewhere.
Thank you for that introduction. Can you all hear me? Okay. So, I first learned about Monique Truong's writing more than a decade ago when a colleague shared a passage from Bitter in the Mouth, her 2010 novel about a Vietnamese refugee adopted as a young child by a white family in Boiling Springs, North Carolina. Looking back as an adult, that woman narrates, "Since leaving Boiling Springs, I was often asked by complete strangers what it was like to grow up being Asian in the South. You mean, what was it like to grow up looking Asian in the South?" I would say back to them with the Southern accent that had revealed to them the particulars of my biography. My tweaking of their question often left them perplexed or annoyed, as if I were playing some irritating semantic game with them. For me, pointing out the difference between being and looking was the beginning, the middle, and the end of my answer. For me, the daughter of an Iranian father and a white mother who grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the passage was a revelation. This wasn't because the narrator and I had many particulars in common. Unlike her, I'd been born in the United States. The family I was raised by was my biological one. And despite many threats from US officials over the last 40 years, the country I live in hasn't invaded the one where my father is from. But rather, the distinction the narrator made between being and looking put words to an experience I'd lived daily but had never had a way to articulate. It named the frustration of being asked yet again where I was really from, only to be met with bafflement when I insisted Cincinnati really was my birthplace and I couldn't perform the Orientalized stereotypes most Midwesterners had of Iranian culture. So I knew I had to read Bitter in the Mouth, and when I did, I was blown away. Next, I read Truong's first novel, The Book of Salt, which is about a queer Vietnamese chef who cooked for Gertrude Stein in Paris, and I was gobstruck by that novel too, and more generally by Truong's talent for narrating lives that so many other writers working in English had treated as ignorable and invisible. It's perhaps not a surprise then that Truong does this in her latest novel as well, The Sweetest Fruits. This novel focuses on three women who nurtured the life and career of Victorian writer Lafcadio Hearn, only to then have their own stories largely erased from the written record. So these women are Rosa, Hearn's mother from Lefkada, Greece, who met Hearn's father, a British army officer, when he was stationed at her native island. Hearn's first wife, Alethea Maddie Foley, who, after the Civil War ended her enslavement, made her way to Cincinnati, where she worked in the boarding house that Hearn stayed in. And Hearn's second wife, Koizumi Setsu, who met Hearn when he was working as an English teacher in Japan and with whom he had 4 children. I wanted my creative writing students to learn from her careful attention to the details of these women's homes and ambitions and consciousnesses. And I wanted my literature students to see how meticulously and respectfully Truong wrote her way into the experiences of women who were crucial to the success of a famous writer, but whose influence on him has gone largely uncredited. So, back in the fall of 2019, I invited Truong to Scripps. And then, as we all know, the world intervened, and thanks to the pandemic, we had to scrap our initial plans to host Monique in 2020. I'm immensely grateful to Truong and her team for not giving up on us and for agreeing to make the trip out here now. I also want to give special thanks to the Scripps College Dean of Faculty Clark Lecture Fund and the Scripps Presents series for the funding that made this event possible, and as well as to the Scripps English Department and the Intercollegiate Department of Asian American Studies for their support. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank all of the events and facilities staff for their hard work putting this event together. And without further ado, I give you Monique Truong.
Good evening. How are you? Good. Such a pleasure to see your faces, or the top half of your faces. Let's see. Well, I think the first thing I want to say is that my day today began with 2 class visits here at Scripps. And the first was for a class being taught by visiting assistant professor of Asian American Studies, Rachel Yim. And then I also visited Professor Mansouri's class. And to me, that is the highest honor, truly, to have my work considered in an academic setting by such engaged, intelligent students and professors. It's why I write. It's So it's been a really necessary and sort of recharging kind of visit. So I really am appreciative of you coming here tonight to to like the cherry on top of the sundae. So this is wonderful. Thank you so much. I usually have to spend all this time sort of introducing my novels before I read them, but Professor Mansouri has done such a great job. I think I'm just going to jump right into it. I'm going to share with you the first pages from the novel, and it's from the voice of his mother, Rosa. And it's she lived from 1823 to 1882. And this section, she's on a boat. She's on a ship, rather, on the Irish Sea. And she's heading back to one of the Ionian Islands where she's born. And she doesn't have Lafcadio, who is 4 years old at this point, with her. She's left him behind in Dublin, and she's telling her story to a scribe, a traveling companion. And really, she basically wants to tell her story and to have it documented so that one day her son will understand why she had to leave him. So if you think about this as that the storytelling is in essence an act of sadness, an act of desperation, and a desire to be known. Patricio Lafcadio Hearn was born hungry. I could tell by the way that he suckled. From the first time that his mouth found the nipple, he was not one to let go. His eyes opened and unblinking, watching and daring me to tug myself from him. All babies were born with an empty stomach, but not all of them were born with such need in their eyes. His elder brother, Giorgio, was my first blessed one. He had to be coaxed and tricked. The tip of my little finger dipped in honey was what he took first into his rosebud mouth. Then patiently, I would guide him to my breast, where honey and milk would mix. This soothed him, but it was not enough to keep him. Giorgio shared my milk with Patricio for less than 2 months. I beg of you, do not call them George and Patrick. Those are not their names. Their father's language is not mine. Even before I was certain that there would be a blessed second, I suffered his appetite, which was growing in me swift and strong. Patricio demanded of me the small things from the sea, whelks, which no one sold, because the people on Santa Maura, same as on Cergo, the island where I was born, would not buy something that they could gather like pebbles at the shore. In the mornings, I would leave my first with old Iota, the only woman on our lane with no children of her own, in order to bend over the wet sand until I felt lightheaded or until my basket was full. Patricio wanted the whelks boiled, their spiral of flesh removed one by one. He allowed me olive oil and lemon with them, but never vinegar. When there was no longer a doubt and whelks became too difficult for me to collect, Patricio insisted on cockles, of which there were sellers, because cockles were found on the sandbars far from shore, where the tide came in like the hand of God. To lose your life for mere cockles is a curse as old as the sea, and may you never hear it spoken. Like his father, Patricio disliked garlic. He purged me of all foods, even the favored cockles, if they took on its flavor. I would whisper to him that these cloves were the pearls of the land, holding them close to my swollen belly so that he could become accustomed to their scent. But he was not to be convinced. He emptied and emptied me again until I was starving. I soon gave up on the hope of garlic and steamed the cockles open with a sliver of shallot instead. Patricio could not get enough of those briny creatures. It took buckets of them to fill us. During the last months when we were one, Patricio confined us to sea urchins, their egg yolk bodies scooped onto chunks of bread, every day to make sure that we had enough. Old Iota paid 4 boys to wade into the shallows at low tides, where these spiny orbs darken the water, like the shadows of gulls flying overhead. Fatten on this fare, day in and day out. I took on such weight that I could take only a few steps around the bed, an animal tied to a stake. By then, Charles, the father of Giorgio, Patricio, and soon, God willing, my blessed third, was already on another island, in waters so far away that I could not understand the distance between us. Before his ship set sail, Charles had told me the exact nautical miles between the islands of Santa Maura and Dominica, but a long string of numbers was as useless to me as the letters of an alphabet. When I open my mouth, I can choose between two languages, Venetian and Romaic, but on paper I cannot decipher either one. When I was young, I had begged to join my elder brothers in their daily lessons, but my father refused. He said that if I ever left his house, I would enter into the house of God or the house of my husband. In either structure, there would be a man present to tell me what was written and what was important to know. My father was not thinking about a man named Charles Bush Hearn from the island of Ireland when he told me my fate. My father was not a man of original thoughts. He repeated what came out of the mouths of other men, primarily those of nobility, minor like himself. He taught my two brothers to do the same. They all believed that this echoing made them wise and far wiser than me. To be a daughter is another curse as old as the sea, and I was born hearing it. Thank you.
Let me just start by asking, because I'm not sure, especially among the students here who weren't in our classes today, what people know about Lafcadio Hearn. So maybe could you tell us a little bit more about him, but then also what drew you to this project, which isn't really about him, but about the women around him?
Right. It's a massive bait and switch. But Lafcadio Hearn lived from 1850 to 1904, and he's often described as being half Greek, half Irish. But that's also a massive bait and switch, I think, because his nationality was actually, he was British. His father was Anglo-Irish. And when he was born on the island of Lafcada, which was then known as Santa Maura, it was not part of Greece. It was a protectorate of the United Kingdom. So complicated, yes? And then when, by the time he passed away in Tokyo in 1904, he actually was one of the very few Westerners to hold, to be a naturalized Japanese citizen. So I describe him as being half Greek, half Irish, Japanese author. And that really confuses people, and hopefully they'll want to know more about that. He is known in the US now primarily as the author of the very first Creole cookbook in the United States. And also as being from, being one of the foremost Western expert on Japanese folklore, fairy tales, ghost stories. And he was incredibly famous in his brief 54 years of life. But I should say that if you are from Ohio, and I grew up in Ohio too, in Centerville, Ohio. What? No one? No one? He's considered a son of Cincinnati. And he's also a son of New Orleans. And basically, wherever he went, he seemed to have been sort of embraced and beloved. He started out as sort of a muckraking sort of journalist, but really it was about his true crime writing that made his name in Cincinnati. One of the very best essays by him is called Gibbeted. And it's about a hanging that goes wrong. And he writes in this, just, you are there, unfortunately, with this poor soul who's being executed. But yeah, so he's had many lives, many places have claimed him. And as I shared with Professor Mansouri's class, in Japan, he's still incredibly beloved and well known because he has a collection of ghost stories that some of you may know. It's called Kwaidan. It was also made into a film. But that book is on the curriculum for, I think it's middle school students. So like I'm going to say national curriculum, but maybe it's sort of a standardized curriculum in many places in Japan. So the students grow up having read him, but they read him via his Japanese name, Koizumi.
Yakumo, right?
Yeah, Yakumo. And they don't realize that he's a Westerner. So I went to Japan to do my research, and I encountered many people who are not in an academic setting, just folks, who are like, oh yes, I know, Kwaidan, and it was written by a Japanese, and I was like, no, it was written by someone with a Japanese name. But anyways. So that is a very long answer to who Lafcadio Hearn is. And yes, and your follow-up naturally should be the same as Professor Mansouri's follow-up is, well, what does that have to do with you, right? And I write a lot about food. I also collect old cookbooks, and I grew up not only in southern Ohio, but also in North Carolina. So I have this whole connection to the southern food world. I know, you're thinking, huh? But it is true. And so within the southern food world, he is very well known. And I saw his name in an encyclopedia of Southern food, and none of it made sense to me. Why would this man had this connection to Cincinnati, to New Orleans, and then go off to Japan? What is this interest in ghost stories and folklore? And so, I bought his cookbook, and I read it, and it made me incredibly angry because it's really, it's an outrageous cookbook. It really, you could tell, he said things like, men are better cooks than women. because they have a more scientific mind, and so will measure much more carefully, and so on. And the cookbook is designed, it's written right there, it's for new homemakers, so for women, for young women, starting their lives with their men, right? And it says things like, well, if it doesn't taste right, then you did something wrong, so try again, I just thought, this man is just not very likable, So when I get into that mode is when I want to know more, I want to know, well, how did he get to Japan? How did this, for me then, an unlikable man like this, become an expert on Japanese folklore? And so I started reading the biographies about him, and there are lots of them. And it turns out that he wasn't the most interesting figure in these books. It was the women in his lives. And yet it was a very patchy sort of history that was available, because of course the books are not about them. They're about Lafcadio Hearn. And what I read, again, made me want to know more. And I think ultimately what that comes down to is the fact that, I had to leave my country of birth, my language, my everything when I was young. And I couldn't imagine that this man did this willingly. And I think that is still the thread, that even after I found more about him and I grew out of, I liked him, I didn't like him, it's like, it's a relationship you have with these figures as you're working on these books. But that was still that's the strongest thread, is that what was he looking for? And whether these women, I don't know, did he find in them what he needed? Did they find in him what they needed as well, right?
Yeah, thank you for that answer. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what it was like working with what you could find on these women, because some of them, I think 2 out of the 3 aren't literate, right? If I'm remembering that correctly. So there's not a lot that they could have written down about themselves or that made it into the historical record. So,
right.
So how do you take that and make it into a narrative? And what do you do when there are gaps?
Yeah. Right. Well, I actually don't like to use the word illiterate. I use the word or the phrase did not have access to the written word. Because to me, that really brings to the forefront that it's about privilege and access, right? And it is true, his mother and his first wife did not have access to the written word for different reasons. The mother was growing up in, it was, her father, well, now I'm talking about my novel as if it is the the facts. But let me tell you what I did find about her. In the biographies about Hearn, Rosa, his mother, is described as being sort of, illiterate, right? That she was petulant, that she was childish, that she was overly religious, that she had temper tantrums, and was essentially, really, she sounded like an underdeveloped human being, like a caricature of a person. And I asked myself, how do we know this? How do the biographers know this? It's hearsay. And it's because Rosa could not have kept a journal. She could not have sent letters. She, it was told to someone. It was Lafcadio O'Hearn did not live with his mother, so whatever he knew of his mother or put down onto paper, which he did, was really an imagined mother. He didn't write these negative things about her, but someone did. and so I had to think through what it meant to be a young woman who was being cloistered within her home. This I knew as a fact, and had access to the church, and that was her life, her world, and yeah. So as for Alethea Foley, she was born into slavery, and it was against the law to learn how to read and write. And what do I know about Alethea Foley? I know what Hearn wrote about her. And he had two, in addition to brief mentions in his correspondence, there were two newspaper articles that he had. One talked about how there was a boarding house cook who could tell these amazing ghost stories, that she was a ghost seer, and how the reporter is sitting on the back steps of a boarding house, and this woman who is described in a way where, in the coded language of the time, she's biracial. The hair is described in a particular way, and the reporter basically says, I can't do justice to her storytelling, prowess, but this is what she said. And the whole thing is in quotes thereafter, right? So he just basically says, I can't do justice to it, but here it is. and why is that important besides there she is on the page according to Hearn? What's important is that Hearn was very much a product of his time, where he wrote mini pieces, where he tried to capture the patois of the black folks who lived in Cincinnati. And it was done in a way that is incredibly painful to read. It's a caricature. It's a diminution. It's painful. But when he wrote Alethea's voice, he didn't use that patois. He used something else, and he did a kind of a different kind of othering to that language, but in a way that felt like he was trying and to capture a kind of poetics that she had as a storyteller, and so I use that as my template, and then I use other examples of writings that what I call like the adjacent research. If you can't find the material on your particular character, your particular person, you find the materials that are available to people who live lives akin to theirs. Right.
And I'm curious, was there, because the three women in this novel are so different. I mean, it's kind of amazing to think that they're all connected by this one man whose life literally spans the globe. Was there one that was either a particular favorite to research and write or a particular challenge?
I thought you were going to ask a different question. But I'm going to answer your question first, and then I'll tell you what I thought you were going to ask me. For me, the most, I think the hardest voice to reach was Setsu's voice, the Japanese wife, because her experience is farthest from my own. Well, besides, I'm trying to use the language, my English language, to capture the voice of a character who is, speaking obviously in Japanese, but I also knew that she had a very particular regional dialect. There's also, for those of you who have some Japanese or are fluent in Japanese, you know that there's a language, there's kind of a language that is sometimes called women's language. It's just, there are certain words that women will use that men will not use, and it's still it's still something that you can look at Japanese sort of today and find examples of. So there were all these markers of how I knew she would have kind of shaped her Japanese that I could not do in English. And one of the things that I shared with Professor Mansouri's class today was my novel has been translated into Japanese. And my Japanese translator was able to introduce those nuances and forms back into, I don't know if that even works, but introduce it to Setsu's literary voice. And that to me is incredibly exciting, except I have no Japanese, so I'm taking it on faith that this is happening, or has happened. So I was going to tell you what I thought you were going to ask. I think it was my second reading ever for the book. Someone in the audience said, which of the voices, or which of the characters, the women, do you feel closest to? Which one is most similar to yourself? And I had to answer, and I think it was very disappointing for them. And hopefully it's not disappointing for you, because listen through what the full answer. I feel I'm much closer to Lafcadio O'Hearn. That's my closest sort of, because I'm a writer. I take stories from people, from living people, from people who have passed. I am nurtured and kept in some state of saneness by people around me, and like him, I'm living far from my home, and yeah, so Lafcadio, that unlikable man has taken this form.
It's funny, that doesn't actually entirely surprise me, though, because despite the damage that he does as he's kind of moving throughout the world, because he is such a product of his times, the book is compassionate to him also. I mean, you could imagine a version of this book where someone takes that irritation you initially described and it becomes, you know, in trying to recover these women, it becomes a caricature of Lafcadio. But I think what's really remarkable to me is how it manages to hold both sides of that. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. I think that the word that I've been hanging on to for many years now, especially as our nation, the world around us has become so divisive, is the word "and," A-N-D. I had to hold many versions and many forms of Lafcadio in my head, that he was just not a person who benefited from, you know, from taking the stories of Japan and sort of becoming known as an expert. If you stop there, yes, you know, you can say this man is, I don't need him anymore, you know, but that same Lafcadio is the man that allowed me to find Rosa, Alethea, Setsu. Without him, we would not have, you know, even the partial history of these women. And that's just a fact, that the people who were able to document, the people who had access to the written word, you have to look at what is there, and you have to take what you can and what, you know, what flushes out the history that we have.
That's beautiful. And I want to hear, maybe the last question before we open it up to the audience, a little bit more just about the process of how you do that as a writer. Because I mean, one of the things I find so remarkable about your work is the way that your books are able to hold so many particulars of so many complex characters all at once. And not just the Sweetest Fruits, but your other two novels as well. And I'm just wondering, what is your process like? Because I'm sure for each of these books, there could be a mountain of research. So how do you go from there to getting these women or your other characters on the page?
How? Well, my novels have all been written in the first-person voice. And I shared with Professor Mansouri's class that is really how I begin to understand my characters, is I try to hear their voice. How do they use language? What's their vocabulary like? What do they reach for when they want to say that something is you know, like this, they want to describe something like the taste of a cherry, you know, like what do they reach for? What do they reach for when they want to describe for someone, you know, a feeling of a kind of ecstasy? That sort of thing. It begins with that. I mean, that, of course, has to be preceded by research, because I'd like to work for some odd reason within this you know, historical fiction sort of genre. But actually, it's not odd. It makes perfect sense to me, because to me, this history. When I write historical fiction, I try very much to work in between the facts, right? I try not to change, you know, facts. But if you are writing historical fiction about women, about people of color, about, you know, about the subaltern, you are not going to have a lot of facts. So the area in which you get to create your work is expansive, so yes, there's a lot of room to work as someone who's writing historical fiction when you center these kind of characters.
Well, I have many more questions I could ask, but I'm sure there are audience members who have questions as well. Would anyone like to ask a question? Yeah.
Hello and welcome to Scripps campus.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for Scripps Presents, Professor Leila Mansouri, for inviting me here. I wanted to follow up on the last question because in some ways historical research on subjects that are minor in history or subjugated or subaltern does require alternative ways of finding out the truth about their lives. So when you create those worlds, just as a historian might do, how do you hold yourself accountable with to create a sense of how do you go about creating characters that are not only believable but can be authenticated as such in history?
Yeah, I did. It's a great question. Well, let's see. I feel like that's it's just a big, incredible question that I'm going to answer it in sort of to give you an example, right? I did not really understand, for example, what the life of a woman like Rosa was like on the Ionian Islands. The Ionian Islands are on the western coast of Greece and eventually became part of Greece, but was basically held by many different, the Republic of Venice had it for a while, the Ottoman Empire, then of course, by the time I sort of came to it, my characters came to it, it was already a protectorate of the United Kingdom. So I did not know, let's back up by saying that I knew that Rosa was in her mid-20s when she ran off with this Irish surgeon, right, who was in the occupying army, the British Army. And I thought, in mid-20s, in the 1800s, that she was past her prime, as it were, right? She was past what was considered marriageable and viable and valuable. And I wondered, what is the story there, And so I wanted to know sort of what was the family structure like? What was the life of women, right? And remember, her family was considered minor nobility, so some money, right? And I looked, and I could not find specifically that subject matter, right? But I did finally find, not in a book, not in a published book, but a thesis that was not published, but was on the web by a scholar, a woman, a Greek woman. So your question would be, well, Monique, how can you, how could you be assured that this is work that, it didn't get published, did it? Right? It didn't get vetted. It didn't go through the system. right? Of vetting a work. So you have this PhD thesis, which is exactly about what you need, in order to fill in that world and to understand that it was a cloistered world for these young unmarried women. And my response to you would be, I had to ask myself, well, you're right. This has not been vetted, but at the same time, why did this not get published? I have read many dissertations, and this seemed very well written. It seemed like it had all the sources, cited. And I thought, well, why did no one want to publish this work? So do you see by my example, sometimes what we consider accountability, right, is actually a kind of perpetuation of what is valid, what is considered worthwhile, right? So yeah, I do work in that gray zone, right? And that's the thing, I'm not a historian. So, it's kind of, it's kind of almost like a little get out of jail free card, but I don't mean to use it that way, but there is a difference. I would never consider myself and would never present myself as a historian. But then again, you have to ask yourself about historians and how you can have a gut instinct that there is something missing here. And if you can't find it, if you can't find the kind of documentation, the kind of that would sort of shore up this thing that you could see in the gaps, you're lost. I mean, you're lost within that discipline, right? Right.
I think we have time for one more question. If not, then I will ask.
Okay.
What's on deck next for you?
So what's on deck is I'm writing a libretto. I've, in the past, it feels like I've just started working as a librettist, but that's actually not true. It's been almost 10 years now. But I'm learning on the job still. And the libretto is for a composer named Randall Ng. And it is it is for a multi-composer, multi-librettist opera that is going to be called Broken Mosaics. And it's being commissioned by a theater company out of Boston called White Snake Project. And it was, they had this idea that they wanted to respond to the surge of anti-Asian violence. And they wanted to look at the term Asian America, and look at how many stories are actually within that umbrella and how often we only hear some of them. So this is why it is a multi-composer, multi-librettist kind of effort. And Randall and my piece is set in Virginia, where Randall's family have roots. He's Chinese American, and his father is in, I think maybe in his late 80s now. Randall and his father went to Norfolk, Virginia, where his father grew up. And it was the first time that Randall heard that his father had worked as a young man at a restaurant in Norfolk called the Oriental Chop Suey Cafe. And so I said, that's where the opera is. This is the young man, 15 years old, working in that restaurant, and how he becomes a doctor in Staten Island. You know, that's the journey. That's the opera.
Well, that sounds wonderful. I can't wait to see that myself. Could we give Monique Truong another round of applause, please? Thank you so much for coming.